Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Patrick Anderson, to discuss the controversial topic of critical race theory. Dr. Anderson is an assistant professor of philosophy at Central State University in Ohio. He also writes for Mint Press News and the Black Agenda Report. Dr. Anderson earned his Ph.D. at Texas A&M in both English and philosophy. His research focuses on the Black radical tradition and Africana philosophy, as well as the connections between technology, ethics, and colonialism. What prompted our guest today was 3 articles that he wrote in Black Agenda Report explaining the history of critical race theory. Today we're going to discuss that concept, which I wanted to start by noting that critical race theory actually the term was coined or presented almost 50 years ago. Why suddenly has it become such a hot topic, a perspective and an approach that's more than 50 years old?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So, the term critical race theory was coined in 1989 for a conference, but the kind of work, scholarship, the research that is called critical race theory goes back at least to the early 70s, if not before that. Today, it's a hot topic because there is a concerted right-wing effort to brand certain kinds of teaching, politics, movements that they don't like as critical race theory. And of course, the origin story that is told in this right-wing narrative is that critical race theory comes out of something called cultural Marxism. Yeah. And I've studied a lot of social and political thought. I still have yet to find anybody who's a cultural Marxist, so I'm not even sure what that is. The controversies of today have been, sort of dealt with in the commentaries on this, but it's not the first time that this sort of thing has happened. In the late 1990s, there was a sort of backlash against critical race theory during Obama's presidency, as a video came out of him giving Derek Bell a hug, and so that prompted this look at critical race theory then too. So it's only a matter of time before this cycles back again, I think.
Okay, well, I'm glad you mentioned Derek Bell, because I'd like you to explain to our viewers kind of the origin story of, I understood it largely started in legal studies, but it was a centering of race and institutions regarding race. Maybe you can just give us a brief recap of how it was launched, so to speak.
Yeah, so Derek Bell really is at the center of the emergence of critical race theory. He was working as a litigator during the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, and coming out of that, he made his way into academia, got an appointment at Harvard Law School.
He was the first black law professor at Harvard, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
He's the first black law professor at Harvard, and at the time, he started to doubt the gains that could have been made by the civil rights movement, and he says, in legal studies, we don't have any methodologies that critique the law's relationship to racism, both the way that the law creates racist structures and sustains racist structures. So he started developing this work throughout the 70s and 80s. During the 80s, it gained the interest of a lot of students in the legal profession, and by the end of the decade, you sort of had a full-fledged movement emerging that really flourished during the 90s and early 2000s.
So when Bell talks about it, maybe you can explain it a bit, how race is reflected in the law, or how race contributes to those institutions. What does that mean exactly? Mm-hmm. People have heard this probably on MSNBC or something, but what does that mean exactly? Say race imposes itself, or race appears in institutional structures of the law. Yeah,
so up until the 1980s, and I would say this vision does persist in many areas in legal studies, as far as I understand it. But there's this sort of view that the law is a neutral, rational, text-based institution, and it can be approached not through sociological analysis or power relations, but what is the rationality of the text of the, whether this is a constitution or legislation, right, statute, law, and so on, court decisions. And Bell actually introduces a kind of sociology of law view to this, and he says, let's not just look at law out of context, but let's place it in the social historical context and analyze it. How have the broader racial contours of American society influence the way that legal decisions are made or the way that laws are written? And how have the way that legal decisions are made and the laws are written influenced society back? And before him, there wasn't really any analysis of this kind of thing.
Would an example of this, I read that black youth get arrested for marijuana possession or cocaine possession, although the more white youth use, and black youth get sentenced at, I don't know, 8 times as long terms as white youth.
Yeah.
And as part crack cocaine versus dry cocaine, I'm not sure of how this, but is that an instance of saying, here's the law, the judge just says, well, I'm just interpreting the law and I have to sentence you to this term because that's what the law says.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
it seems to, on the ground, to have a different inflection.
Yes, absolutely. So in legal studies, the term would be facially neutral, meaning that it doesn't say race. The words black, white, brown, whatever do not appear in the law, so it's facially neutral. But then when you actually look at the outcomes of what the laws produce, that's where the sociological analysis comes in. And so Bell is part of this history, I'd say critical race theory is one version of trying to bring this more sociological approach to law, and it would be doing exactly that sort of thing. It would say, wow, isn't it interesting that, for example, when someone gets sentenced for cocaine possession or use, the minimum sentence is so much lower than the minimum for crack, and it's because cocaine was at the time, right, associated with wealthier white people, and crack was associated with poorer black people.
So the law was written that way? Is that what the city council or somebody would write this law with this understanding, even
Right.
though they would say we're being facially neutral?
Right. As long as it doesn't say race, then it's just a principle that applies to everyone. But we could quote the famous poet and playwright Bertolt Brecht, who said, "It's equally illegal for both rich people and poor people to sleep under bridges." But yet we know that rich people will never be subject to the enforcement of that law because they don't have that problem. So
you talked about Bell's approach and the early legal scholars' approach that were approaching the law from what you called a realist or a materialist perspective, was saying that the practice or the material conditions gave rise to an explanation. Before now, it seems often it's like, well, if we talk this way, then what happens? People act this way. He was suggesting it's the reverse.
yes.
So we have slavery, now we have to have an explanation for why, and it's because blacks are inferior. So how would this be understood in the 70s, 80s, even 90s, that we have certain material conditions and it gives rise to certain understandings? How does critical race theory approach this?
Yeah, I think the example of slavery is an excellent point. So one way to understand slavery and the emergence of it is that, well, Europeans always just hated black people, thought they were animalistic or whatever the case may be, and so that's why they became the targeted population to become enslaved. A materialist analysis of this, and you would find this in 19th century black thinkers like Martin Delany, you could find this in 20th century thinkers like Du Bois, and then of course up to Bell, is the reverse. The idea is that, well, slavery becomes economically viable or even desirable for the people, which happen to be European descended white people, in power at the time. And so they create the institution, but now you need a justification for it, and it's because they're not full humans, they don't have souls, or, originally it was they're not Christians, but of course there's a loophole around that. You just convert and now all of a sudden, there's an issue. So it became not about Christian versus heathen, but it became white versus black. And so it emerges out of that context, but that means that the development of this racist sort of ideology is a response to, it's a problem-solving measure, so to speak, right? They're facing some actual question and they say, how can we justify this institution? So if we move forward to today and we think about things like mass black incarceration, then we can say, oh, well, the reason that we can justify this is because
they're criminal.
Black people are more criminal than white people, right? They wouldn't have been in jail if they didn't break the law. Rather than thinking about what are all the systemic things that lead to crime, how do we decide what's a crime and what's not?
I'll give you one example. In the city of Chicago, the city council keeps introducing legislation that keeps getting overturned, but nonetheless the police enforce it. If there are 3 black teenagers standing on the corner, it's considered gang activity. And in Chicago, it's often black students that are standing on the corner, and they are just standing there having a conversation, shooting the breeze, but they are suddenly, on their record, it shows gang activity because that's the law. So you're arresting them, and the arrest is explained as gang activity.
Right. And I mean, there's a long tradition in political theory that, has shown that there's no such thing as something that is a crime, like an action or an activity that's a crime in its essence. It only becomes a crime once it's criminalized.
Yes.
So, to take a modern example, right? Marijuana use or possession, right? It's not that possessing or using marijuana is in and of itself some kind of evil thing, right? It's that somebody decided that we're not allowed to do it, and we're going to give the state power to enforce that rule. Like, that's how it becomes a crime. If you take that law away, it's no longer a crime. It's not like it's still a crime
Right
even
here
though the
in
law's
Indiana,
there.
if you have marijuana, you're a criminal. You go a few miles west, you're in Illinois, you're not a criminal. You go a few miles north in Michigan, you're not a criminal. Only in Indiana for exactly the same practice, which is an interesting thing, which leads me to my next question, because you talked about there's 2 different versions of critical race theory, one that's reality-based or realist-based and materialist-based, and then there's another that's an idealist-based. And the idealists, like with our marijuana example, would say, well, first, marijuana has to be understood as dangerous, therefore that's why we have these laws. And what the realists would say is, no, you have these laws that criminalize it, and then we have to have an explanation that it's dangerous. So how does this apply to critical race theory? Because somebody like Kimberly Crenshaw has a different explanation, right? We have these symbols of what it is to be white and black, and because we have these racial differences, what happens is we have discrimination, so we want to change people's thinking. So how do we understand this as a different variant of critical race theory?
Yeah, and so to kind of draw a distinction between the realist or materialist versions of CRT that's represented by the work of Derek Bell and the idealist versions of CRT that would be represented in the work of someone like Kimberly Crenshaw. And I choose them because they're founding figures of the they're very well known and influential. The difference here is that they not only have a different perspective on how to analyze the problems and what causes and effects are and so on, but they also have different conceptions of what we would call moral psychology, meaning how is it that people come to make the moral decisions that they make. So for someone like Derek Bell, who's a materialist, he says people don't normally make decisions that go against their fundamental interests. Yeah. Whereas, so for him, if you want to get someone to do the moral thing, you have to impose a cost to them for not doing that.
Or provide an incentive.
Or provide an incentive in some kind of way, right? For an idealist approach, it's an epistemic failing. It's not having the right knowledge about something. And so this is the way that we primarily talk about CRT today, right? If we're going to teach the history of slavery, if we're going to endorse a New York Times 1619 project or something like this, that we have to grapple, with this essential part of American history or something like that, once we teach it and people fully understand, then they correct their knowledge and therefore can correct their moral behaviors, right? Yeah. So, but Derek Bell, of course, and most other realists are going to reject this view. It's not a knowledge failing. Derek Bell is going to say, white people know what they're doing. We shouldn't say that, like they were just ignorant, right? That they actually have an interest in maintaining it in some kind of way. And this doesn't mean that there's not different groups of white people with different conflicting interests, but it means that the clash between those interests of white people end up producing certain kinds of results and so on. So these different moral psychologies are also part of these 2 different sort of approaches.
Is there room in the materialist realist approach that Bell and others continue, you included, I would say, but is there room there because Bell wants to talk about power and the material relations of power that give reward. Is there room to understand that what you just said, white people, not all white people are beneficiaries of power? they may believe they are, or there may be some modest thing like I can drive down the street and I won't get pulled over, or I can stand on the corner with a few friends. So in that sense, there's some material benefits. But is there room in this materialist approach to critical race theory to see that there may be some interest from like white sharecroppers in the South having with black sharecroppers in the South, or now black steelworkers or black auto workers, the white auto workers, white steelworkers, seeing that there is some useful interest in making an alliance? Is there room for that?
Yeah, so I think this is a great question. And, one of the things that I think is so fascinating about Derek Bell is that he does actually have a pretty well-developed ethical theory that scholars really don't explore, because they hear, some of his stuff like racial fortuity or the permanence of racism, and they go, oh, well, I'm going to tune this out. But yeah, I would like to say something about this. So for Bell, people will primarily act according to their interests, and they will do the moral thing so long as it doesn't cost them too much. So one story he tells is of a friend of his during the civil rights movement going into a segregated lunch counter and sitting down, and the white person working at the counter wouldn't serve them, and there was a white couple that sat down next to them, and the person came over, the white person working there came over to serve them, and they said, oh, it wouldn't be very good for you to serve us until our friends are served. And so those white people, they pressured the server into actually serving the black people at this counter, right? And Derek Bell will say the cost was very low for these people to do that. If the owner of the establishment told these white people to get out, they could just go next door and go to the next restaurant or something. Police aren't going to be called. They're not going to be bit by German shepherds, right? And so it's very low. Whereas during Derek Bell's time at Harvard, he actually went on strike to protest the department's refusal to hire a black woman in the law faculty there. And he talked with other law faculty who said things like, I agree with your goals, I disagree with your means. And he was pointing out that they're not going to give up a tenured position in a Harvard faculty because the cost is too high, right? Even if they otherwise think that the goal is noble, right? And Bell ended up leaving Harvard, which nobody thought he would do. And the reason that he said that is that he said, in their minds, they couldn't conceive of somebody giving up a tenured position at Harvard for a moral stance. And he did that very thing, and they were all blown away by it because they couldn't imagine someone doing that. And that's why he's saying that most people think within their interests. Now for Bell, that move of doing the moral thing, even though it's a cost to one's interest, is called courage. So that's where this virtue of courage comes in for Bell, and he gives historical examples of this. Paul Robeson, one of the most famous performers in the United States, well-liked by white and black people. He was touring, he was putting on shows, making a lot of money. He wouldn't sign on to the Cold War. Now all of a sudden the FBI is harassing him, surveilling him, following him around. He gets his passport revoked so he can't leave the US and speak about what's going on domestically. His shows are getting canceled. It literally cost him in his interests, but he stood for what was right. And so for Bell, Paul Robeson is an example of a courageous individual. You could say the same about Muhammad Ali and so on.
That may be a good segue, because if we talk about the idealist approach to critical race theory, which I think is probably most prominent now, even though it threatens people, it's still this version that says, well, we just have to think a different way. If we educate the students, then they won't be racist, and if they're not racist, the laws will change, and things kind of flow from that. So why has that become most prominent today, and where did that come from, I guess?
Like the dominance of the idealist approach?
Would you say it's dominant now within critical race theory?
Yeah, I would say that there's not really many realists left in the academy even.
So how does this happen? Was there a retreat? Did people not have courage, or was there some power, so to speak, that makes the idealist version more prominent?
Yeah, I think power is part of it. So Richard Delgado, who's another founder of critical race theory, and I think he would be situated firmly in the realist camp. He has some disagreements with Derek Bell, right? It's not like a monolithic sort of a view, but they have similar methodologies and philosophical assumptions there. Delgado points out in a 2003 essay that when you look at the development of critical race theory as a field during the 1990s, the idealists, and I borrow this term from philosopher Tommy Curry, who writes about critical race theory from a realist perspective, calls it the idealist turn. And it's not just that the idealist approach of discourse analysis and correcting our knowledge about things leads us to make better moral decisions when it comes to race and equality. The idealist turn happens because these are the types of projects that are getting funded. Yeah. These are the types of scholars who are getting tenure track placements in high-profile universities and departments, and and all of this actually resonates very well with the civil rights narrative that CRT originally started out to challenge. The original civil rights narrative in sort of the mainstream liberal politics was that we can achieve equality if we have integration, yes. And that equality is the end goal of all of this, right?
But equality defined as integration.
Yes, and into integration, right? And idealism still believes that equality is possible. The realists tend to be a little more skeptical about it, and Derek Bell outright says it's not possible.
Well, would he allow for the possibility? It's not possible under the current social structure, institutions, relations of power, but equality as a goal is something that would require a different strategic orientation than the one that the Civil Rights Movement or the Congressional Black Caucus has. I mean, I'm not a Derek Bell scholar, but I just wonder if there's a space there where he says, yes, it's possible, but we can't keep doing this. Mm-hmm. We need to look at other strategies, which would be more towards a separatist or a black nationalist or some other independent politics, those kinds of things. So.
Right. Yeah, so, for Bell, I think there's a couple things here. First, I think he is pretty conclusive that racial equality is not possible. And he doesn't say this as a metaphysical truth about the about the universe. What he says it as is as an inductive conclusion about his reading of American history. So he says, let's read American history, see what the patterns are. Oh, you mean there's no sort of like grand arc of justice that leads us towards racial equality? There's all this cyclical back and forth process. So that's how he reaches that conclusion. And so then the second aspect of this that I think is very important is about this question of what are the ultimate values that we are striving for. And when I say we, I mean this in two senses. We in sort of humanity or, in people in this society. And then in a second, we as for Bell, black people in the United States specifically. And I think Bell is going to follow Du Bois on this. So in the introduction or at the beginning of Color and Democracy, a book that he published right at the end of World War II, he says, the present war has proved to us that European civilization, Western culture, cannot be the civilization for what humanity ought to strive. And in fact, in the conclusion to Wretched of the Earth, Frantz Fanon reaches the same conclusion. And so I think Bell is actually saying it's not just that equality is impossible, but we don't want to actually integrate ourselves into this culture, right? That makes it impossible, and that gives us the wrong kinds of values. Yeah. So he wants to actually turn, he's a race man. He wants to turn black people's attention away from what are quote unquote American ideals and towards something else that can be created or drawn upon within the broader Africana traditions of culture and thought.
Excellent, thank you. We only have a couple minutes, so this is probably not a fair question, but I'd like to end. Maybe you can encapsulate if what you're saying about critical race theory and this idealist turn that kind of makes accommodation with the institutions that exist. Why do conservative political forces specifically feel such a threat from something that you're suggesting is really not threatening? Why would they feel a threat, or are they just using it for...
I mean, Chomsky said that American society is the most propagandized society, perhaps in world history. And, all that is propaganda. What they describe as critical race theory in right-wing media doesn't really have anything to do with the intellectual traditions that, that I've studied as a scholar of this, and that I've seen other scholars working in as well. So it really is just, it's a propaganda thing. The thing I was most interested in is that even in the sort of liberal media that was trying to respond to that and say, no, critical race theory is this very important thing that teaches us about slavery and history and racism and so on, even they were getting it wrong. Even they were giving this watered down version that didn't didn't have anything to do with what I was familiar with in terms of the tradition. And so, coming back to the essays that got me here in the first place, right, Black Agenda Report, I wrote those essays because I thought, there's this right-wing line, there's this liberal line, and everybody's getting, there's something important missing here.
It's kind of like the argument between the Democrats and Republicans, but the policy is going to end up the same.
Yes,
so.
Yes, and I just want to, if I have one sort of point of, recommendation or something, just read, people, right?
Yeah.
That's all you got to do. The texts are out there, they're online, they're in libraries, you can find them.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. I appreciate that, but that's all the time we have on our program. Thank you to Dr. Patrick Anderson for joining me today on Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. I will see you next time.